We saw in the last episodes that the 5 books of Moses probably weren't written by Moses. But what about the New Testament? What about the 4 Gospels? Tradition says that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the evangelists. 2 of them apostles and 2 of them close friends of the apostles, so very trustworthy sources. But tradition also told us that Moses wrote the first 5 books of Moses, and we already saw that that's probably not true. So what do we actually know about the people who wrote the 4 Gospels? Well, for one thing, none of the Gospels actually tells us who wrote it. They are all written anonymously. Secondly, everyone agrees that of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written earlier and John was written later. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke share many of the same stories and same sayings of Jesus. Scholars call these 3 the synoptics, which means seeing together, because they're so similar. But these stories and sayings aren't just similar, as one might expect. In many cases, they are word per word identical. Now, any school teacher who's presented with 3 different reports that use many identical phrases knows exactly what's going on. Somebody is copying. The question is, who is copying from who? Are the synoptic writers copying from each other? Are they copying from a common source or sources? Now, this isn't some new skeptical idea that the gospel writers copied from each other. Even as early as St. Augustine, who was no dummy after all, careful readers knew that someone had copied. But because Augustine accepted tradition, he assumed that Matthew wrote first and then Luke and John copied from Matthew. But modern scholars aren't quite as ready to accept this at face value. And so to help determine which of the Gospels is earliest and who's copying from whom, they look at the places not where the Gospels are absolutely identical, but the places where there's a slight variation in one from the other. And by comparing these variations, for example, if 2 Gospels say exactly the same thing and one is a little different, the one that's a little different usually isn't the original. It represents a change, a copying error, a manuscript error, or just somebody deciding this verse needed to be changed. It's usually not the original that's different. Take, for example, these 3 phrases here. Suppose I have 3 different versions of this phrase in manuscripts. I have, number 1, Bill took a nap. Number 2, Bill was tired, so he took a nap. Number 3, Bill took a nap. Well, I can probably assume that Bill took a nap represents the original, and that Bill was tired is something that was added later to explain why Bill took a nap. So using this method on the Gospels, it appears that Mark is the earlier of the Gospels, and that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. Sometimes Matthew changes something, sometimes Luke changes something. But rarely do Matthew and Luke agree against Mark. So the majority of scholars think that the author of Mark wrote his gospel first, and that the authors of Matthew and Luke each had a copy of Mark sitting in front of them when they wrote their gospels, and they used Mark as a framework. Each of them used Mark as their basis, and then they added their own information about the birth and the Passion of Christ, for example. One of the things that both Matthew and Luke added to Mark are a number of sayings of Jesus. And once again, these sayings of Jesus are so similar in wording in Matthew and Luke that there must be a common source for them. Scholars call this common source Q, for Quelle, the German word for source. However, and this is curious, each of the gospel writers puts these sayings of Jesus in different contexts. The Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, for example, happens on a plain in Luke 6. is used by Matthew as part of Jesus' instruction when he's sending out the 12, but in Luke it's part of a teaching to a much bigger gathering. Why don't Matthew and Luke seem to agree about where and when Jesus said these things? This is probably because the cue source that Matthew and Luke are copying from is simply a collection of sayings. This was a very popular form of ancient literature, the collected sayings of wise men. Proverbs is an example of that kind of literature. So Matthew and Luke probably had a collection of the sayings of Jesus in front of them, but with no idea as to where in the life of Jesus these sayings should be put. And so each of them put those sayings into Mark's framework wherever that author thought they best fit. Now, this theory got a considerable boost when a collection of the sayings of Jesus, very much like what scholars imagine Q to be, was found in the desert of Egypt at Nag Hammadi in 1945. This collection of sayings is called the Gospel of Thomas, and we'll discuss it more in another episode because it's a very important source for the sayings of Jesus. Now, none of this is to say that Matthew and Luke were doing anything wrong or trying to take credit for someone else's work. After all, they wrote anonymously. All they were trying to do was assemble the best history of Jesus that they could with the materials they had available to them. And after all, does it really matter to us how high above sea level Jesus was when he gave his sermon? Of course not. What matters to us are Jesus' teachings. And using these methods can help us to extract a better view of Jesus and his teachings. Until next time, I'm Keith Campbell.